Good morning, everyone. Great to be back here. Been a while, and a long period of online events and video calls and things in between. I'm very happy to see many of you here in person again, and I would like to welcome you to our first EEX Group Sustainability Conference. We will have a number of panels, and if you don't have the opportunity to attend all of them, we will record all of these sessions, and they will be made available on our YouTube channel, EEX TV, so you have a chance to look at it later if you can't be there in person. A very warm welcome on behalf of the whole EEX team. This is a special day for us because it's the first time that we have a conference totally dedicated to the topic of sustainability. You may think that in these days there are more urgent topics to talk about with the ongoing war in the Ukraine, the huge rises in energy prices and uncertainty in the market, and they all have a big impact on the energy sector, both the companies and even us individually. Certainly, this is also one of the main drivers of the difficult situation that many of our customers are in, and the center of the political discussion at the moment here in Europe. However, the two things are linked, and the current crisis is one that is also caused by the dramatic climate change. The extraordinary weather situation that we're seeing across Europe have contributed significantly to the current lack of power production. If you think of missing rainfalls and all of that leading to the current high prices in the markets. And we see a clear responsibility for us as a company to rethink our business models and develop new smart ideas and overall accelerate the efforts to meet the Paris target agreements. As EEX, we are committed to addressing the environmental change and bringing decarbonization to the forefront of all the discussions around energy. We have integrated sustainability also into the core of our business, and thanks to the firm belief of the whole team at EEX Group, I'm proud to say that sustainability has become an essential part of our vision, of our strategy, and of our DNA, how we operate as a company. At EEX Group, we share the same values and therefore believe in building secure, successful, and sustainable markets together with our customers. And that is what we do worldwide. We want to contribute to the necessary change and proactively enable the energy transition. And by that, we want to help to design the world in a more sustainable planet. So EEX Group is developing its offering with a close look on sustainability and everything we do, and our approach to design our markets in a way that renewable energy can be integrated in the easiest possible way. What that means in detail is what we want to discuss with you today in the framework of this conference. So let's have a brief look at today's agenda. First, we will start with a panel discussion on the question how exchanges can support the transition into a decarbonized future. After that, we will have a panel on the Energy Forum that will discuss the sustainability and if it's just a transition into environmental aspects or a broader consideration. Then we will take a closer look at the emission trading. So our carbon chat will be looking at the question on how exchanges can contribute to the decarbonization through pricing of carbon. And last but not least, another panel discussion will focus on shipping and how the EU ETS will impact the maritime sector. As I mentioned earlier, this transition can only happen if we all contribute. We, you, all of our customers, clients, and partners, and all other market participants have to act together. And this is why I'm happy to see you all here today. I encourage you to not only listen to what others have to say, but actively engage in the debate so that we have a continuous dialogue and that we can achieve sustainable change together. I wish all of you an interesting conference day. Thank you very much. And now we're going to start with the first panel.
Hello. Yeah. All right. Welcome, everyone, also from my side. I'm really honored and happy to introduce this day with the opening panel. In the next hour, we will have a discussion with these three distinguished speakers on how exchanges, but also markets more broadly, can support a sustainable transition. My name is Ellen de Vocht. I'm part of the EEX Political and Regulatory Affairs team and the Sustainability Committee. And I'm really happy to have this relevant conversation with representatives from the exchange side, the financial sector, as well as the energy industry. In this hour, we will have a look at the past, what has been done already, what have markets shown they can do, look also into the present, what are the current challenges, and do we still believe that sustainability is a priority for the future? And we'll end the session with a short Q&A. So I will, without further ado, introduce our panelists to you all. First of all, we have Pauline Engelberts. Pauline is a Global Chief Operations Officer from ABN Amro Clearing and also the Global Chief Sustainability Officer. She works with industry partners and clients to understand what is needed to transition to a more active and transparent sustainable market. Pauline is also an active member of the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Advisory Committee, providing input and advice on stock exchanges and derivatives exchanges. Thanks a lot for being here, Pauline. Then, of course, don't have to introduce this too long, but Peter Reitz, our Chief Executive Officer of EEX and ECC since August 2011. Before that, Peter kicked off his career within Deutsche Börse in 1991 and Eurex as member of the management board. I can also add, we've just heard that already, he's a very strong motivator to bring sustainability to the heart of the exchange. Finally, we have, last but not least, Adam Berman, the Deputy Director at Energy UK. Adam's role is that Energy UK works closely with policymakers towards market-based policies that harness the power of the business community to drive the energy transition. Previously to Energy UK, Adam was Policy Director at IETA and worked as an analyst in the energy industry on international climate policy issues. With that context, I'll immediately turn to you, Adam. We're here at the Building Sustainable Markets Together conference to discuss what it takes to build sustainable markets together. Of course, building sustainable markets and a transition especially focuses most often on the sectors with the highest potential impact and the highest emissions. So that's why I want to ask your perspective from that side. How does the energy industry look at the market and on their place within the market to build sustainability?
Sure, a very unenviable task of kicking the discussion off. So I think the thing I'd say from the energy sector perspective when it comes to sustainability issues more broadly and how the market can enable that the money is largely there. The money is available for the transition, but it just needs to be harnessed and sent in the right direction. And I think, these are difficult messages at the moment in this very unique time that we're in to be sending, but unfortunately, the thing that is required is a very large degree of investor confidence and a relatively stable regulatory environment. I think we are probably going to get onto why that's difficult at the moment, and it's a really tricky balancing act for governments around Europe and around the world to try and deal with. But I think the one thing I'd say is that we just need to be sure that amidst this crisis, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so I'll just use one example from the UK's perspective. The UK now has, we've reduced emissions by about 45% in the UK. The vast majority of that comes from the power sector. The vast majority of the generation, the new renewable generation, the low carbon generation in the UK is offshore wind. And the way that's been done is by one single market-based solution, which is a contract for difference, a government-enabled contract for difference, which is a contract with the government to guarantee a certain price. And because the government has guaranteed that, it's meant an incredibly high level of investment certainty and an incredibly low level of risk for the energy sector. So we have all this noise going on outside us at the moment with the energy crisis. And I think the thing we have to make sure is that these pivotal market-based devices are still in place during the crisis and beyond the crisis.
Thanks a lot for that, Adam. Turning to you, Peter, how do you look at this from an exchange perspective and the role of a market operator?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize the challenge ahead of us is huge. And the investment need is far beyond what's already happening today. And if we hear that the money is there, what is important is that we have the right mechanism to allocate it. And I think that's where market-based solutions can be of help. And that's where exchanges can be of help. Because we have, on a market-based solution, the most efficient way to allocate investments beyond the very basic function of an exchange to even show the real price of carbon and climate change. So I think those two elements are the parts that we can contribute to the solution.
Yeah, and Pauline, we've talked about this certainty and this long-term investment certainty. Looking at this from the financial perspective and the clearing perspective, could you elaborate how you look at this in terms of financial instruments, but also from a clearing bank, how you see this role?
Thank you. Well, I think we have the same role. Is clearing wants to help towards effective and safe transition. And our main responsibility is to ensure stability in the markets and also to have robust risk management frameworks so we can manage the stress and the volatility that arrives. But we have been focusing the last 20 years on actually increasing the access to the markets, because I think it's important that many participants can work towards this transition. So we have a global energy offering. We have connected to 90 exchanges, and 25 plus actually have energy and commodity contracts. And we're a settlement bank agent for cleared power and gas, for non-cleared power and gas exchanges. We provide execution, repo financing, physical deliveries, and we do technical analysis. And we really are trying to position ourselves as the power clearing bank to help provide that, because the role of derivatives is actually in steering those capital flows, as Peter was saying, to the sustainable economy. And if there is not a mechanism to actually hedge your risk, then people will not be investing in some of the large investments that we need in the infrastructure. And we also feel that the derivatives help in the analysis of risk, and it promotes long-termism and transparency. Futures and options in particular help in the price discovery, which also helps manage the risks that you see coming. And it's not the first energy transition, as I was saying before, but now we, as opposed to only focusing on a financial impact, we also have to focus on the ecosystem. And I think that also brings extra complexity, but also new markets. So we will advocate in the industry to help actually empower this transition, and that's the role we want to play.
If I can add to that, when you talk about long-termism, I think that's one of the key elements when we think about investment decisions to be made in additional renewable capacity. And I also think that that is another area where exchanges and clearinghouses can contribute. It's because of that we have, in the course of last year, actually the year before, extended our range of maturities so that you can actually trade power futures 10 years in advance. A lot of these renewable capacities are financed through banks like yours, and you can actually secure your income stream over the first 10 years and hedge it with exchange-traded futures. So you also have the counterparty risk out of the equation, which, especially in these very long-term maturities, is a key risk for financing such an investment. And that's another example of how exchanges can help with the transition to sustainable energy.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for those examples as well. And Pauline, you've mentioned a lot that ABN AMRO is doing in the markets that you're offering. What would you say has been the biggest driver of this? And I'm, of course, always looking from the regulatory perspective. What would you say that the regulation has taken part in this as a driver or maybe a barrier of these steps?
I think I have to say what Peter also said. It's a very complex and multifaceted problem that we're actually facing. I think one of the biggest barriers is that it's slow. The energy transition is slow. There's a lot that has to happen on the infrastructure side and technology, and we also have to change consumption of energy, which is a barrier. So besides the physical infrastructure challenges as well, capital cost is a large barrier. A lot of money is needed in renewables and in the infrastructure. Changing behaviors, I think we have to think long term. We have to think collectively. I think it's a shared destiny. It's not just one, the energy market's problem. It's all of our problems. And we also need the political will. And that can be a barrier, but it can also be a nudge. The problem, though, it takes a long time before some of the regulation or some of the political agendas are actually pushed through. But if you do look at the Inflation Reduction Act or the Repower EU, there are things coming out of the politics and regulation, which is actually nudging us towards the right direction.
Do you see this as well, Adam, in the energy sector itself and for the energy firms? What would you say as regulation played a role there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange time because you see both kind of wonderful solutions and dreadful solutions being suggested in equal measure. I mean, in the UK today, we seem to be on the cusp of announcing allowing fracking again for the first time in a few years, and I think it's just a perfect example of where it doesn't really matter what you do here. The market has already decided which direction it's going in, and it's not going in the direction of fracking. Whether you believe that for moral reasons or for market-based reasons, that's simply what is happening now. So I slightly think that yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree that there's lots of areas in the kind of crisis management at the moment where the vast majority of policymakers are saying that the route out of this crisis is through, the single cheapest form of energy generation, which is now low carbon. It wasn't 5 years ago, it is now.
Yeah, I see you nodding, Peter. Anything you would want to add there on the side of regulation, or what has pushed EEX as an exchange to take these steps?
I think regulation and political decisions can be an enabler. And if you look at this more long term, I mean, the fact that we have a EU ETS, this market didn't exist. It was just created by a political decision and a commitment to reduce emissions. And the knowledge that this is the most efficient way to do so. So this is a perfect example where regulation helps. I also agree there are some other elements of ideas at the moment floating around that would not be helpful in the overall long-term perspective, but hopefully the political decision makers will distinguish between the two and take the right decisions. So I think you also mentioned earlier that a stable regulatory framework is of importance, because these decisions that investors make in additional renewable capacity are decisions for decades. And you can't do that in an environment where the regulatory framework changes every other day. So I think that is also a key element of regulation being an enabler for the transition.
I might also just bring up, so I don't know how much people here in the audience realize when you're investing in a, let's say, a major new low carbon infrastructure project, quite how much regulation there is at the moment. And it can be positive and it can be negative. So, for example, if you are building a major new wind turbine in the UK, and in fact, I think this probably goes for most EU regulation as well, although I know it less well, there are so many steps that you have to get your contract for difference, you have to get your seabed lease with whoever's leasing the seabed, you then have to ensure all the engineering is sound, you have to do checks around water, around environmental quality, that there's going to be let's say a net gain in terms of biodiversity, or at least it's going to be neutral in terms of biodiversity when that project goes through. You need to consider as an investor what the tail risk is going to be after, let's say in the UK, you have a 15-year contract for difference, so you have a 25-year lifespan of that asset, so what's the energy market going to look like in 15 years plus? And by the time all of this stuff has come together, it's been 8 years. So the regulation is good and bad. It's good in that you can't just do away with regulation on, let's say, an environmental byproduct of new infrastructure. But at the same time, if we're to allow the money that is sent through the markets to be used as well and as efficiently as possible, we also need to lower some of the regulatory barriers to actually getting this infrastructure in place.
I fully agree, and I can confirm that is not only a UK problem. We have similar problems across Europe, and in many cases, the bottleneck of creating additional capacity is not the money, it is the permit and the time it takes to get to the final permission to actually build.
Yeah. No, that's all really interesting. I mean, we've mentioned it a few times already. Of course, I mean, the current situation and the high energy prices make everything just a bit more complex. And I mean, we've spoken about the money. The money is there, and the market has already chosen his direction, and this direction is sustainability. It's the most cost-efficient thing to do. But looking very concretely at the energy industry itself, Adam, is the energy transition still the first priority right now, and is it an affordable to do at this stage?
Well, there are differing views on this. My sense is it is still the first priority, but it's not called the energy transition anymore, and we were just having this discussion. It's called energy security. It has a different name, but it's fundamentally the same thing. So, as I said with fracking, like, fundamentally the market is where it is, and we need to ensure not only that we're building the stuff that is cheapest, which is low carbon, but also that we have markets that enable consumers to benefit from the low costs of that low carbon infrastructure. The one thing I'd say is it does feel like we've come a long way since, sort of the halls of COP26 last year when everything was climate. And it's not now. I work in advocacy and I barely use the word climate now. I use the phrase energy security. That's how I look at things and how I would frame issues, certainly to the government here. And I think what you can see from the longer term solutions, so, if we're looking 2 to 5 years now, perhaps hopefully once energy prices come down internationally, we all know what those solutions are going to be. They're going to be a rapid expansion of your low carbon generation and broader energy infrastructure. It's going to be energy efficiency. It's going to be retrofitting houses, heat pumps. All of this stuff, again, is largely cost competitive, or on the energy efficiency side, almost cost competitive, perhaps not quite. And so I think, certainly from an energy industry perspective, there is a path dependency now, and that's a really positive thing. And as I say, I think almost that we have to be, it is a silver lining of sorts, perhaps a very small one in comparison to the scale of the crisis, that this crisis is happening now and not at a point where it was still requiring substantial government subsidies to build, even kind of small scale renewables or kind of low carbon assets.
And do you see this as well, Pauline? Of course, the past 2 years have been extremely challenging. I can imagine also on the side of risk management. Adam confirms, okay, sustainability is still the priority and the way to go for the energy sector. Have you seen any large changes on the side of risk management and clearing? And what would you imagine could be the impact on the transition from there?
Yeah, I think it would be an understatement to say that the energy market is not prone to shocks. It's the accumulation of these shocks that is making us actually have to revise the way we look at risk. And we have to get a better and deeper understanding of the position of our clients as well. So what we're seeing is that there's stress in the players in the market. There's higher discretionary margins. There's multipliers that are being put up on top of base margins. And we can't rely only on the backward-looking models, but we also have to look at the impact in the forward-looking models. So the knock-on effect is important. So what we see is that for clearing, we're relatively lucky in the sense that our risk positions are short, they're not longer. But we do see that there's a lot of competition in clearing houses. We see that transactions are moving away from clearing to go to the OTC markets as well. We also see clients that are being either off-boarded or that there's a risk that we don't want to take. So there's some hesitancy to take on more risk. So that's probably those are the biggest changes that we see at the moment. And I look at the analogy and I'm thinking, if you look at the banking crisis a number of years ago, OTC transactions, less transparency on what is actually happening. That's where you saw interventions, bailouts, single resolution funds. So I think it's important that we look at that when we develop our risk models.
Is that something we've also noticed on the exchange markets? Is there something that we've learned particularly over the past 2 years and have decided to do differently or to re-evaluate our role there?
Actually, we have not changed the way we operate our markets much. If anything, the perception and the taking of that offering has changed. I mean, as a direct reaction to this crisis, we've seen actually a move towards clearing with a lot of people that were highly aware of the counterparty risk they're taking, using clearinghouses as a sort of a safe haven in very uncertain times. And we have clearly seen that happening in the energy market. We have new customers that have never used the exchange before, did everything OTC so far, now using a clearinghouse because of the heightened volatility and the risks that are attached with that. So we've seen that trend, and clearinghouses are a security mechanism in these days. This is even more important. And secondly, I think on the topic of capacity, we have a supply crisis. We don't have a market crisis, a market design crisis, and we are explaining that to all of the political stakeholders at the moment, that the price that we're seeing is just reflecting the fundamental situation of supply and demand, where you have a supply shortage and an inflexible demand curve. And that's what we can make transparent, which of course also sends investment signals to those who want to go for additional capacity, because there is a clear incentive to do so, given the price levels right now. And that is, again, agreeing with what Adam said earlier, the cheapest and the quickest way to build additional capacity nowadays is renewables in almost every part of the world.
Oh, thank you for agreeing with me, and now I'm going to disagree with you, because that makes an interesting conversation. So I absolutely agree with you when it comes to the kind of financial markets, but the primary, primary fuels pricing is what it is. That is an internationally set price. I think the reason you're seeing such discontent across Europe and in the UK is that the physical energy markets are not fit for purpose. And it is simply not appropriate in this day and age for gas. Gas in the UK, gas generation is about 40% of our overall generation, and it sets the price almost all the time. That is simply not an appropriate kind of situation now. So I think that's an area where there is learning, but it's not necessarily on the financial markets, it's more on the physical side. But again, I think that the slight problem is that from a political perspective, markets are markets. It doesn't matter what they are. We may disagree with that. We may think that's not necessarily a good assumption to make. But I think when politicians see that physical markets and the energy markets in Europe are not perhaps performing well, I think it kind of casts a pall over all markets more broadly.
I would just like to add, though, if you're going to be changing the pricing mechanism in the markets, you are because of the physical issues, you are really going to affect the risk models as well. So it's connected.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to say there's clearly quite some scrutiny. I mean, Peter said it's a price crisis more than a market crisis, although there's a lot of scrutiny from the public, from politicians, from regulators on the market design, and discussions also ongoing at this very moment about whether the market design is still fit for purpose. How do we see, when we bring this back into relation to sustainability, do we see this discussion and this scrutiny as endangering somehow the transition and the long-term steps that are already being taken? Maybe starting with you, Pauline.
I don't think scrutiny is a bad thing. I actually think scrutiny and followed with considered regulation is a good thing. It also provides leadership, transparency. It helps us make informed decisions. I think seeing now the big impact on consumers versus some of the companies due to the pricing mechanism is also thanks to the scrutiny that we've actually put on the markets at the moment. So, and there are benefits if I look at the, say, the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets in any case. Measuring and monitoring is necessary to understand the credit effectiveness of it. So that scrutiny is what we need to understand what the impact is of these carbon credits. And we also have to include reversal risk, which is something that we talk about in carbon markets. So it's know your carbon, like we had know your client, know your carbon, and that is something that is thanks to scrutiny, personally. So I welcome it. I think it helps us change. I think it helps us look at where we have our impact and where we do not have our impact. And yes, it is in the context of supply, demand, policy, also activism and scrutiny that we have to work.
Would you agree with this more positive perspective of scrutiny, Peter?
In general, yes. And even the regulators these days see the value of price transparency in carbon markets. It's been interesting to read even the CFTC, the US regulator, stating as their initial recommendation to establish a price of carbon, so that can be the guiding mechanism to allocate all other political interventions. So I think in this example, scrutiny is a good thing, because then it will encourage even more market-based mechanism to allocate the resources correctly. And I mean, the question of whether sustainability is still the topic. You can rename it, yes, but ultimately what we're talking about is a decarbonization of the energy industry, and that contributes to both crises that we're facing at the moment. Renewable energy is the solution to the climate change crisis, but it's also the solution to the current supply crisis, facilitated to a large extent by a shortage of gas in Europe.
Yeah, and I might just add on the scrutiny point that I think, it's interesting both in the EU and the UK. around ETS, there have been lots of discussions around transparency and accountability, and certainly within a sort of very highly regulated market like that, it seems entirely appropriate to understand, as long as you're not literally disclosing individual actors, positions in the market, it seems entirely appropriate to consider the flows and whether there is manipulation, and certainly I think it's been the fundamental conclusion of regulators that there is not. That being said, it seems wise to ensure that continues over time. And I think for broader markets, being in the crisis that we're in, I think having that level of transparency and scrutiny is beneficial because it allows policymakers to know at a time when, frankly, there are huge fiscal outlays from governments all across Europe to support consumers, which are the companies that are making quite a lot more money than they have done historically without necessarily having taken a kind of business strategy that might have come with high levels of risk that you might imagine, therefore it would be more appropriate for them to get higher levels of profit. These are simply profits from assets that have benefited from higher prices, whether it's through supply chain issues or energy prices or whatever it may be. And I think that's really beneficial, ultimately, to have that level of accountability in markets that policymakers can really understand what's going on.
And I think the EU ETS is a good example of that. You even have voices these days that call for, let's suspend this market for a number of years, or let's stop it altogether. I think this would be a completely wrong signal. I mean, this mechanism, as you know, EEX is also the auctioning platform for all the EU states. And we have collected, just in the first 7 months of this year, more than 24 billion euros for these governments. And rather than stopping that mechanism, let's think about how to best allocate that money to change the current supply crisis and support more renewable energy.
Do you see this same discussion on the ETS in the UK, Adam, and how do energy firms look at this?
Yes, thankfully it's a slightly less robust discussion in the UK than in the EU. Just there are various other kind of policies in the UK which get more attention than the ETS, which in some ways can be beneficial. I think the point about the ETS, and actually you've even seen on the UK trying to get ahead of this issue around kind of financial transparency in the markets, I think the point to make about both UK and EU ETS is, yeah, of course, there's a huge amount of revenues being distributed to governments, which they can use for crisis management now. That's incredibly good. And we know now from regulators, but other reports, that the allegations of kind of financial manipulation simply don't stand up. However, we need to ensure that we don't give those that may not be so fond of the ETS or other mechanisms, we don't give them any excuses, we don't give them any reasons to destabilize that mechanism. And that's why I think this conversation about transparency is really important, because if we don't provide it, we are giving energy to those people. I mean, there was a piece in the FT this morning about the Polish position regarding the EU ETS, and whilst, of course, we could understand their position, it's really hard once you've stopped a mechanism like this to bring it back. And I think that's why we're desperately trying, certainly in the UK, we're trying to ensure that these key climate pillars in terms of policy remain, because that's not where the vast majority of prices are coming from at the moment. It's a tiny proportion of energy bills, which is the main outlay for people all around Europe at the moment. So really, if you want to deal with the problem, it's energy. It seems like the ETS issue is a problem, or is a solution in search of a problem, I think would be the right way of putting it.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about what markets have already done and the challenges that we're seeing today. And I mean, I'm quite happy to hear that there's still some optimism, and to hear that sustainability is still on the top of our agenda. Looking into the next years, Pauline, what would you say do you and AB and Amro Clearing see as kind of the major trends and the major next steps to come?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we have to consider when we look at this. We look at the regulatory and political space. We look at also the NGOs, the activism. We look at our own license to operate and our own targets. But I think if we take it broader and we look at the latest IPCC report, which was about climate resilient development, there were 4 areas to look at, which was adaptation, mitigation, and system transition. And what we see is that the current flows is just too low. It's focusing on reducing greenhouse gases, which is good, but we do need to have that money going to the actual changing of the systems as well. So we will need more information, we need more transparency of data so we can actually get more money to go to where it actually needs to go.
And how would you see the become a reality, having more access to data and more transparency? Is that a role for regulation, or do you see a role for a clearing bank and an exchange in this?
I think it's a role of in the industry, and you see a lot of developments at the moment looking at data and transparency of data. You see, and what we need to do is we're going to have to start disclosing more of that data as well, which is a push from the regulatory perspective. So the access for the data so we can make those informed decisions is what we all have to do, either on a transactional level or on a corporate level.
Thanks a lot. And looking to you, Adam, in terms of the looking at the future perspective, the long-term pathway and the direction has been set, but what would you say are the next steps concretely?
I think the next steps are learning the lessons of the last few months and probably learning the lessons of what the next few months will hold as well, which is to say that I think personally my view would be that all markets would, or no markets, were built for the sort of volatility that we've experienced, not just through the energy crisis, but also through COVID. I mean, markets have been remarkably resilient. However, I think it's the responsible thing to do once this crisis has largely abated, to look back and think, what lessons can we learn? Certainly for the energy market, there are big lessons that the energy market was not prepared to deal with the scale of the crisis that we're facing. I think also on the financial market side as well, there are questions about how we ensure that volatility is prepared for. So for example, some people would have picked up that on the European side, there is perhaps a kind of credit line being prepared for generators who, for the purposes of trades, have to come up with significant amounts of collateral, which most simply don't have because of the high energy prices at the moment. And that's a form of market intervention where the market hasn't worked as it should do, or it hasn't quite been as resilient as it could have been. And so governments have stepped up and said, all right, well, we will guarantee this. And I think that's just, I don't think it's a problem to say that's a lesson to be learned for the future, that we need to make sure that the next time this comes about, we don't need to go to the government for help, that the markets can solve the problem without that sort of intervention.
How do you look at this, Peter? What are the next steps for EEX, but also for the exchange markets in general?
Well, if we look back at this situation today in 5 years or 10 years, this may actually be the accelerator of the energy transition. Because as I said earlier, renewable energy is the solution to both crises that we're facing. And the current focus on energy independence in Europe can also be facilitated by this, because nobody can create a shortage of wind or sun, as we're seeing being created on gas these days. So I think decarbonization of the energy is more important than ever, but it also contributes to the current shortage of supply situation. We will see an increased share of renewables, but that also means we're going to see more volatility going forward, especially in the spot markets and the short-term markets. So I agree with Adam. There are some lessons learned that we need to adapt overall from a model where demand was given and supply was trying to match it, to turn that completely around and say, oh, now there is supply and we're going to have flexibility in demand that we can use energy when it's available. This will be a major change, and we're just starting to see it happening in industry and not even on the retail level. But in a fully decarbonized world, there still needs to be one element that is storable, because there will be times when there's no wind and there's no sun. And that element, we all think these days, is going to be hydrogen. And that's a market that hasn't even started to develop yet. We are engaging in building it, and building it means, in the first step, building transparency on what's happening there, on price transparency. We're trying to create an index on hydrogen as a first step towards an infrastructure and a trading infrastructure on something that will be part of the solution long term.
I'd just like to add to that, you're talking about the changes we have to make. The next IPCC report will be about behavioral change, is how do we actually deal with these changes and these questions on supply and demand as well. And it's a really important contributor to how we actually deal with our markets.
There is a second element that I think will come into play. I mean, ultimately, we're addressing a global problem here, and we don't have a global price yet. We are seeing efforts to develop carbon prices in different parts of the world, and EEX is engaging worldwide to help people establish ETS or the equivalent thereof, and design it in a way that they can easily be connected afterwards, because ultimately we have to work towards a global price of carbon, and that's the long-term goal that we're working towards.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot for that. I think we've learned a lot of important takeaways that sustainability is still a priority. Yet there are a lot of challenges before us, especially in the current situation. I just want to ask one final question to Adam and Pauline, because of course the title of this panel is how can exchanges support a transition to a decarbonized future in real terms? Of course, as EEX, we have a lot to say about that in the next panels as well, but I also wanted to take this opportunity to ask the both of you, what do you expect from an exchange in enabling this transition?
I think the exchanges are crucial and fundamental to this whole transition. So I would actually like them to continue to allow participants to enter the markets. I did add one quicker time to market, but that's not only up to the exchanges, that is up to the political will and the regulatory environment as well. But product development, as you were mentioning, hydrogen, new market development, and maybe also look at some easier access, some of the barriers to entry, because I do think it's important that we allow all these participants to enter the market so we can meet more demand and supply.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. Exchanges are crucial for the energy market. I'd maybe just touch on 2 points. The first one we've already discussed, which is transparency. And the importance of transparency is if, as I think probably everyone in this room knows and understands, it's markets that are going to be, with government support, the primary mechanism for delivering finance. We need to make sure that they are held in high regard, and that transparency allows that high regard. I think the second point is probably in relation to efficiency, actually. The energy transition requires us not just generating more energy, but using our energy in a much more efficient way. And that's about having the financial products and mechanisms in place to actually utilize and benefit that from that higher level of efficiency.
Thanks a lot. I think those are very nice words. Peter, do you want to add anything to this or reply to what is expected from us as an exchange?
No, I thank all of you, both of you, and we'll take these things into our strategy and our program. We are committed to deliver the tools that are necessary to enable this transition. That's what I said in my initial remarks, is the DNA of EEX Group. So we will continue to do that and develop it together with our customers and partners.
Well, thanks a lot for this. I think we have about 15 minutes left to allow some questions from the audience as well. I see the first question there. A mic is coming your way.
Yeah, sure. Very, yeah. Sure, a very live issue, that's for sure. So two separate issues. One's about, there's a fundamental review of the energy market, of really the electricity market going on in the UK at the moment. Second is about a specific kind of crisis solution. I'm not sure that exchanges are an explicit part of that process going on at the moment within government, or at least a review of how exchanges are involved within that process. But I think there are lots of areas in which a greater diversity of financial products is going to be an incredibly important enabler of the type of, as I said, kind of efficiency, heightened efficiency that we hope to see within the energy system. So I think that's what I'd say about the review. Just in relation to your latter point, if people aren't aware, there is one solution on the table at the moment in the UK that some of the kind of older generation of low carbon generators are moved to fixed term contracts, lower cost fixed term contracts. So essentially it's a revenue neutral scheme which spreads out the cost to consumers over a much longer period of time rather than sort of bunching it up in just the next kind of 2 to 3 years, or however long energy prices are as high as they are. To the best of my knowledge, the government is very interested in that scheme. I would just say there are high level ongoing discussions between industry and government on that, but with no conclusions yet being reached as far as I know. But you'll have to wait until Liz Truss's speech, which may be about now. So I don't want to prejudge that.
Okay, thanks for the question. Thanks, Adam. Any more questions? Yeah.
Hello. It's a question for Peter. You mentioned EEX was partnering and working with governments who are looking to establish ETS programs so that they could be linked together in a way that could at some point create a global price of carbon, which is great. Can you give any indications on which partnerships and how those discussions are going?
Yeah, I can give you a report of what we have done so far, because we are engaged not only in the European scheme, but also in the US through our US exchange, nodal exchange. We are supporting the regional initiatives that are there, both on the East Coast as well as the California scheme. And there are discussions about expanding those, and we are actively involved in that. We have created a ETS mechanism in New Zealand with a local partner, the New Zealand Exchange. And we have partnered with some exchanges in China to help develop the Chinese national scheme that is now being established. And there are discussions in some other parts of the world where we're trying to encourage people and share the experience that we have, because we have started to deal with these markets in 2005. So we have a lot of experience, and anybody who's looking at this as a brand new idea or problem can benefit from those experiences that we have made. So we are engaging wherever there is an initiative and government support to establish the pricing of carbon.
I might just come in to complement Peter's point. I mean, absolutely, exchanges and the experience thereof is really critical in setting up a new ETS. The one thing I'd just say in response to that question is that I think even just, well, even really 1 year ago, the answer about how to glue these different ETSs together, different carbon pricing systems together, would be that, well, it's quite difficult with a tax. Maybe you have some sort of carbon club or CBAM or whatever it may be. But with an ETS, it's probably linkage that's going to be the main solution. I think we've seen that, you know, linkage has its pros and cons. It can be quite difficult politically. It needs a high level of political will and a high level of agreement on environmental ambition. But that now we have Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, particularly Article 6.2, it allows a whole host of mechanisms now for actually joining up one carbon pricing system to the next, or even perhaps not official carbon pricing systems, but one jurisdiction's, you might link up one jurisdiction's carbon removals with another jurisdiction's demand for carbon removals through an ETS. So those are the types of mechanisms, and again, for all of those, exchanges are going to be critical in facilitating that.
Thanks a lot, both. Do I see more questions? That does not seem to be the case. Then I thank you all for, yeah, another, no problem at all.
Energy UK's position on the UK CPS, and in terms of a alignment with the EU ETS as well. Is that a hindering point, or would you think that long term there is hope? Let's really think 5 years, maybe beyond, or post-2024, perhaps the next UK government, to take the current situation out here. Is the UK CPS not a level playing field in the future integration of perhaps offshore wind, or what is Energy UK's position on the long-term CPS?
A question I can't say I thought I would be asked today, but I'm more than happy to respond to it. So the CPS is essentially a top-up, for those that aren't aware, it's a top-up carbon tax for the power sector in the UK. It's at a fixed price. So we have an ETS, and then we have a fixed price above that for the power sector. There is a longer-term trajectory and a longer-term rebalancing that should happen over time, because the power sector has decarbonised about 70% now of its emissions based on 1990 levels. So there is a longer term rebalancing from the power sector to industry that absolutely needs to take place, and the EU is looking at that as well through the question of how you slowly decline free allowances over time. So that's the same question, it's just a slightly different version of that carbon price. In relation to the CBAM particularly, yes, the situation we're in with the UK and EU and trading arrangements is not ideal. It's far from ideal. The UK, I think the easiest way of answering that is the UK is looking at their own CBAM as well. They're consulting on that later this year. And I think, you know, I don't want to prejudge exactly what our response to that will be, but I think certainly we want to make sure that the carbon costs between both jurisdictions are balanced. So there is a level playing field. So you don't have any kind of curious things incentivized, whether it be, you know, high carbon or low carbon flows from either jurisdiction. You want it to be a level playing field to make sure that we have free and fair trading between both jurisdictions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Adam. Well, before this becomes a grilling of Energy UK positions on every possible topic, I'll thank you all for listening to the first opening session, and I hope we will see you at the next sessions. First one to start in about 30 minutes, I think, on the energy sector itself. So thanks a lot, and of course, refreshments and coffee are still in the same room around the corner. Thanks a lot. And thanks to the speakers.